all the while claiming an election had been stolen from him, and everyone around him knew that was bullshit, right? We were poised on the verge of a constitutional crisis, which may yet return in 2024, and yet we have these guys more worried about, trans overreach with respect to bathrooms. And I get all that. I get how infuriating so much of the woke identitarian nonsense is, but you have to have some proportion, and you have to keep both problems in view. And
why are people not doing that, in your view?
Well, I mean, so to some degree, it's people have, a one-sided take aligns with their biases in many cases. I mean, people have political biases. They were a creature of the right. They wanted to be a creature of the right, and it's just very easy to focus on what's wrong with the left, and vice versa. If you're a creature of the left, it's easy to just be all Trump all the time, and you don't have any time for criticism of wokeness, right? You're going to run I don't know. This could be wrong, but you're Trevor Noah on the Daily Show, right? Like, yes, tell me what fucking Don Jr. did wrong. I've got time for it, but Hunter Biden, who cares, right? Like, so there's an asymmetry there, and but part of it, I think, is outside of normal channels. There's audience capture, right? Like you get signal from the noise on one thing. You've just launched your Substack, and you see that people have endless time for your hot take on COVID and the dangers of mRNA and the spike protein. Boy, doesn't that sound scary? It's called, why they call it a spike protein, right? So let's do 100 piece of content on that topic, right? To the exclusion of everything else that's happening. I'm not saying I know the mRNA vaccines aren't going to fuck some people up or haven't already, right? It's a valid conversation worth having. But again, there's proportion here that gets totally lost in each of these ecosystems. And what's happening out here in Podcastistan and over there in Substackistan is people find an appetite for a certain style of conversation about a specific narrow band of topics, and they just go all in on that for obvious reasons. And it's understandable. But I think it's shattering our society. I mean, we have a society where increasingly, and this is a near-term risk of AI, leaving existential risk aside, we have a society where it's becoming increasingly difficult, and in many cases impossible, to have a conversation about facts that are just crucial to understand for the maintenance of democracy, for public health, for on myriad fronts. And we can't have a real-time conversation that converges on agreement, it seems, and it's just getting harder and harder to do it.
What would be the chance, in your mind, that we make it through the next, let's call it century, as a civilization, with something like us being functioning still intact? Because we have some breakdowns culturally, many breakdowns culturally. We have bad incentives. We have a media system which facilitates bad actors either willfully or negligently or ignorantly. Rising risk of artificial intelligence, desktop printers that can synthesize bioweapons, although there's some pretty good clauses in there that limit that from happening. Population collapse, although not a true existential risk, something that's it's definitely not going to help. Nuclear weapons still out there lurking around. All of the background natural risk that just exists as a byproduct of us being on a single planet at the moment.
Yeah.
How Toby Ord pilled are you when it comes to the conception of the next century or two?
Well, I mean, like Toby, I would just be guessing, but I'm troubled. That's like what I would like to be able to say is, the chance that existential catastrophe is actually going to occur is got to be minuscule, right? Like it's less than 1%. Like that's where you'd want to be. You'd want to be. You're just guessing, but very low probability that we're going to wipe ourselves out, right? That we're going to cancel the future. I don't think that's the case. Like I just think it's whether it's, I mean, even a 10% probability is awful, right? I mean, 10% comes up. You just
the expected value of that.
Just take out some dice and play around and see what a 10% result looks like. How often that comes up, right? I mean, that's terrifying. And I think there are many smart people who would say the risk of real catastrophe is quite a bit higher than 10%.
I think Toby puts it at 1 in 6, right, over the next century.
Yeah, I believe so. And if you kind of widen the footprint of, you take existential risk and you just widen that to extreme risk, right? Just like, okay, it's not existential, but you might want to watch the Road Warrior films a few more times, because that's going to start to look like the future, right? Who wants to live in the aftermath of societal collapse, fundamental societal collapse? Now, it could be like that. That's a totally conceivable trajectory for our species. We could screw up everything and dig out and finally recover, and it could take we could have this unnecessary and truly harrowing detour into something awful for 100 years, right? But who wants that? But if you add that to this possibility space, I don't. How confident can you be that something like that isn't going to happen in the next 100 years, given what we're doing and what we're finding it so difficult to do? And that's what was so dispiriting for me about COVID and its aftermath. It's not that I was so worried about COVID. I was so worried about our inability to respond coherently to something that should have been pretty simple to respond to, right? And so I was, for the longest time, there was this initial month or two where like, who knows how bad this is going to get? Who knows how bad this is? So I was just thinking more about COVID. But after a couple of months, I was much more thinking about it as a stress test for society and for our information ecosystem, and for our cultural norms and our politics. And I really do view it as a failed dress rehearsal for something quite a bit scarier.
Let me lay this out for people maybe who haven't heard you talk about this before, or haven't thought about what happened with regards to our cultural response. You might need a bit more grip on that bottle. There you go. The way that you could see COVID, the way that you could conceptualize COVID generally, would be almost like a dress rehearsal, or almost like a civilizational-wide vaccine, like a test. It was a very weak virus in the end. Thank God for that. The mortality rate wasn't there. Transmissibility was pretty high, but it wasn't super brutal when it came to the deaths, although not great. But what it did do, and I think your worry and mine align here, which is, and I haven't heard anybody, no matter how ardently anti-vax, anti-lockdown, anti-mask, the libtard cucks are coming for us again, this is all Bill Gates's sort of wet dream type stuff. It doesn't matter about those, and I have many agreements with those people. I haven't heard anybody push back against what this did do was prime the next 4 generations of humans, for as long as this is still a cultural meme that continues to take over, for the next time that something like this potentially happens, but this time it's got a 30% mortality.
Right.
Or this time it kills everybody under the age of 10. Or this time it kills all women.
Yeah.
Right? What is the response that occurs there, given how we've been primed previously? And I would love to hear, the like, we don't need to worry about that bro case for that. Because regardless of how you thought, whether it was overreach, whether it was these cucks telling us to stay in our houses, fuck you, I'm going out and playing with the kids and cutting open the locks of the local park. It's made the situation worse. It's made the situation existentially, civilizationally. It's primed us to be more fragile, more knee-jerk in terms of our response. It's not good.
Yeah, well, and that's where I've parted company with many of our fellow podcasters and many of my friends, and in some cases former friends, in this concern around misinformation is the way I would tend to frame it. Many people are out in podcast land are allergic to a concern over misinformation because they're so concerned about the infringements or perceived infringements of freedom of speech, right? So the deplatforming of people from YouTube, like that is the the earth-crossing object that we have to prioritize. Like under no circumstances can that happen. Like even with Alex Jones, like that's just we need to hold the line here. We need to be free speech absolutists of a sort, and that's more or less all they talk about. And then on the other side, we have people who are focused on the misinformation problem. They're focused on the real calamity we just witnessed, where you have public health information that just cannot get through because there's so much misinformation, there's so many conspiracy theories, and there's so many pratfalls on the part of the actual establishment that it's understandable that no one is.
So they're going to listen to you.
Yeah, right. So it's but they're still taking the one that they can't afford to admit any of that because they're so terrified about this erosion of trust in our institutions, right? So it's like, take someone like, there's a few lenses we could look at this through. So you take like a character like Anthony Fauci, right? Like I don't know Fauci, I don't know what's true of him, I don't know, but I just know that on one side he is utterly maligned, right? He's just this goblin who is as corrupt as you could possibly imagine. He lied about everything. He was wrong about everything. Like he is the antithesis of an authority on COVID or anything else, right? On another side, you can still just bring him on CNN as just the most top shelf authority on public health we could hope to have, and the only thing worth thinking about is just how awful his life has become as a result of how he's been maligned over here, right? He's just inundated with death threats. He needs a Secret Service detail because all of these crazy people from Trump on down have vilified him with lies, right? Now, I am totally prepared to imagine that the truth is quite a bit more nuanced, that he could have been a great scientist, maybe he is a great scientist, maybe he did many great things, but maybe he's conflicted in all these other ways which have been discovered by people like RFK Jr. or other people. Some people might have been total crackpots, but they're right about this thing that Fauci did or didn't do, right? And that if we were going to parse it in the middle here, we would find, oh yeah, you know what? This Wuhan thing was always going to go haywire. He should have known it. He's culpable and was lying about his culpability. And that exchange with him and Rand Paul was one where Rand Paul, whatever you think about his politics, was absolutely right. And Fauci, whatever you think about his politics, was basically just trying to cover his ass with this, rabbinical definition of gain of function, which we all knew was bullshit. And we shouldn't be doing this research. And it's Fauci, for whatever reason, can't admit that he participated in something that was awful, right? I don't know if any of that's true. I mean, whether Fauci's involved with that, but I do have a lot of time for anyone who worries about gain of function research and worries about what is happening in labs all over this world. But the problem is that if you're focused on what failed over here, if you're focused on this is a failed dress rehearsal, what we didn't manage during COVID, and the basic certainty that we're going to have something much worse, right? And that we have to prepare for that. It's very easy to see that you just have to basically ignore all of this. Like we just have to stigmatize all of this as conspiracy thinking. All of these people are like non-standard bad actors. None of them have real jobs. They just have podcasts and newsletters. Just get the New York Times and the Washington Post and Harvard University and all these other institutions to hold the line here. let's try to just not shine too much light on the ways we embarrassed ourselves. We're certainly not going to apologize for anything. And let's hope we get a better president, Republican or Democrat, next time, who's not a maniac, who didn't give his first interview to Alex Jones. And let's just get back into a place where everyone trusts the CDC again, right? Now, I don't agree with that, but like 75% of that could be right? Like I think we could age out of all of this hysteria. Just imagine what would happen if in 2024 we had a reasonable choice for the presidency, right? So Trump is not the Republican candidate. We have a more normal Republican candidate who, let's say, wins, right? I don't know who that would be, but let's say whatever, Nikki Haley wins, right? We have President Haley. She no longer has to pander to Trumpistan to be a Republican. We get a more normal politics, and many smart people, however quietly, begin to internalize many of the lessons we should have learned in the last few years about just how threadbare many of our institutions have become and how woke ideology vitiated most of them, right? I mean, how political correctness and just sheer lunacy contaminated our thinking about so many things so much of the time in recent years. And we sort of age out of all of that, and we have a more normal experience of the grown-ups being in the room much of the time, being able to make real decisions. I think that's to be hoped for. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need innovation around that, but like that, some swing back into normalcy is to be hoped for. There's an alternate path to that future that may be more realistic, but the future worth wanting is a future, however we get there, whether it's just sort of like we just, grit our teeth and age into something more normal, or we innovate and dignify all of this hysteria with more and more of a fair hearing. But the thing we innovate to is real institutions that we can trust, right? There is no future worth wanting where we don't have institutions that are trustworthy, right? So we need, it cannot be up to a podcaster to tell you what's really happening in Ukraine when Putin says, all right, we're going to use the fucking tactical nukes now. First of all, in a few months, you're not going to be able to know whether he really said that or whether that's a deep fake, right? So we're going to need an institution, or at least a perfectly democratized algorithm that is vetted by an institution we trust, that can say, this is how you tell whether that's really Putin, or whether that's just some 18-year-old who made that, with a generative model. But regardless of how we clean house with respect to basic information, we need institutions with real experts who really capture our best thinking and decision making on hard problems. So we need a population in every democracy that most of the time can trust those institutions. Like when the State Department says, listen, this is what's happening in Ukraine, this is what Putin's up to, this is why we have the policy we have, this is why we shipped the arms we shipped. We can't have a society where 90% of the people are calling bullshit 90% of the time because no one trusts anyone in charge. That is the end of democracy.
But that's where we are.
That is where we. Much of the time, that's where we seem to be. Certainly, if you use social media as your reference point.
Well, you mentioned this, I think, in a different podcast about how, as soon as you exit social media, you realize just how little of the world kind of does take their cues about the world from social media. I think it's maybe in the UK, 10% or 20%, between 10 and 20% of people have got a Twitter account. But then when you get on there, I think almost all of the content is created by some ungodly small proportion of the number of users. So everybody else functionally is sort of wanking in the corner and observing this thing go off and not contributing, or maybe signal boosting or whatever, but it's the same culprits that they're talking about everything on all sides.
Yeah.
So you end up, I remember this during the general election in the UK, so whenever it was, 2019, something like that. And if you'd looked at Twitter, it would have been a Labour landslide. Stormzy was tweeting about it. I'm pretty sure that some of the actresses that were in Game of Thrones, they were tweeting about it. Fucking hell, Stormzy and Arya Stark are tweeting about the Labour and how bad the Conservatives are, and never trust a Tory and all this stuff. And then we have the biggest landslide in history, in half a century perhaps, to go the other way, because where I'd been, the cultural thermometer that I'd put up the behind of Twitter wasn't accurate.
Yeah, except it was the opposite with Trump and Brexit, right? So what I was noticing with Trump in 2016, or I should have noticed, is that whenever I said anything about Trump or Clinton prior to the election, the support for Trump I was seeing on social media was like 100 to 1 over support for Clinton. I mean, it was just crazy. And the polls were whatever. Trump had a 25% chance of winning. Now, again, I never looked at that poll and thought there's no way Trump's going to win, because a 25% chance is, as we've just established, that comes up all the time, right? So if you're going to dignify Nate Silver as a real statistician with respect to those opinion polls, you can't be consoled by 25% really when you're as worried as you had every right to be about a Trump presidency. But what I was seeing on social media should have told me that the mainstream media's conversation about this was not tracking what was happening. I mean,
well, you can see, given this impending, ever-increasing existential risk background, the landscape culturally that people are inhabiting, whether it be mainstream, whether it be alternative media or whatever, I can understand why people are feeling confused and displaced. And I've noticed on the internet a trend of cynicism. If I was to give it a single term, it would be a very, very high amount of cynicism. Given that there's so much despondency in the world, what do you wish that more lost or cynical or depressed people knew? What would you tell them about this is my worldview, everything's fucked, it's not going to get better, oh my God, my family, my future, there is no point even trying, and the people that say that things can get better, they're the ones that are the real problem. What do you say to people that are cynical?
Well, many of the tools we've referenced so far are incredibly useful. I mean, just take the Stoic piece, for instance. I mean, the real comparison is